My father was born in 1924 in Sarreguemines in France. Both his parents were Polish by birth and had obviously left Poland to come and live initially in France, but then very shortly afterwards they moved to Saarbrücken in Germany, just across the border. And it was while he was at school there, aged 12, that they had the Kristallnacht, when the Germans came and smashed all the windows. During that time, obviously, it was must have been horrific for any Jewish family living there. After that, my father, with his youngest brother and his parents, were sent back to Poland. Their papers were not quite in order. As a result of that, they were not allowed over the border. And the irony being, clearly, if they had been allowed over the border, I wouldn't be here this morning making this video for you. So, fortunately, the Germans were very tight on their protocol, and hence Dad was allowed to come over on the Kindertransport, and he ended up in Bradford in Yorkshire in the north of England. When he arrived, he had 3 months of schooling in order to learn English, and then was sent to work. His first job was working for an engineering company, and he obviously got to a stage where he thought about wanting to join the RAF, but because now that the war had started, he was in the reserved occupation, he wasn't allowed to, because they needed those workers to make ammunitions and such like, which is what he was doing, to support the war machine. He therefore asked the owner of the factory if he could move, and again, another sweet and sour story. The owner of the factory, because Dad was one of his best workers, if not his best worker, said, if you leave, I'm going to first of all tear up your work permit, and secondly, have you sent to a concentration camp. And the curious thing about this story, obviously horrific as it was for a, I don't know, 15, 16-year-old boy in a foreign land, was the owner of the factory was in fact Jewish. So, very curious story. Overall, Dad had quite a colourful journey to get into the RAF. He was clearly exceptionally determined, exceptionally focused. I'm just going to read from his certificate of service from the Air Training Corps. This is where he enrolled in 1942, and it says, a Polish subject, but very anxious to join the RAF, and showed exceptional aptitude, should make a good pilot. This was dated 1942. So Dad was obviously had an ability. They questioned whether he would have the aptitude and an education because of his lack of education. He said, look, I am clever enough, I just haven't had the education that others have had, but if I get through the first thing and send me to learn the mathematics, etc., I'll be fine. And so they actually did send him to St Andrews University for a few months in order to improve his aptitude, which obviously he did. In order to have an opportunity to join the RAF, he had first to then get permission from the Polish embassy in London, because he wanted to join as a British pilot as against a Polish pilot. I think his views were like, when in Rome, do as the Romans. As he was living in Britain, he wanted to be act as the British. And to give an example of his focus and determination, he only had enough money to pay for a single ticket down to London. And he not only got permission from the Polish embassy to fly and join as a British trainee as against a Polish, but secondly, he persuaded them to give him the money to pay for his return trip back up to Yorkshire, which was probably a sign of his chutzpah and salesmanship, which put him obviously in good stead in later life. He then started his training in England and was then sent to South Africa, where he learnt how to fly. A couple of things that really sparked for him in South Africa was the different people who he then met, because bearing in mind how he'd been brought up and his time at the hostel in Bradford and his working in the factories, he was now with boys of a similar age, most of which had been to a public school, and he'd never come across boys like that before, and he was impressed by their level of self-confidence and the quality of their schooling. And he said to himself, when I have children, I'm going to send them to public school. And that may have also given him a degree of motivation to make a success of his future career. A small anecdote was when my father left England to go to South Africa, it was by boat. And on the way they stopped in, I think, Port Elizabeth in South Africa. And while he was there, he heard some Israeli voices on the dockside, and he shouted down to say, that he was also Jewish and that he had two brothers, Izzy and Idush Waxman, and whether they'd ever come across them. And by some incredible coincidence, they were also on the dockside. I mean, you can't really make up the percentage odds of that happening, and they hadn't seen each other since the war had started. What are the chances of that happening? When the war finished, he had a role as an interpreter because of his understanding of languages, obviously. And then he was asked to help supervise a prisoner of war camp in England, which was obviously full of Germans. And he actually realized that the Germans were a lot better organizing themselves without any involvement from the British officers. So he delegated authority to various Germans within the camp, and the camp was run exceptionally well. And it was that time that Dad learnt how to play bridge, because he didn't have much else to do, and became a very good card player. I'm fortunate to have inherited his genes, and I like to think that I have learnt from him the difference between right and wrong and good and bad. And I could say that, and maybe I'm not the only one, I could have learnt a little bit more from him on discipline, which the irony being, because he gave us all the things that he didn't have, obviously he made my life a lot more comfortable than he had had, which obviously I very much appreciated. And now later in life, learning the discipline is a little bit more difficult, but nevertheless important, as I think we all know is the backbone to any good, successful career. One of the big lessons that I learned from my father, who, whatever the situation, to him the glass was always half full rather than half empty. and there was never a situation where he didn't feel that he couldn't find a solution. And clearly he excelled exceptionally well in the business world through obviously his dexterity, discipline, motivation, and determination. And he just little examples of he in his boardroom when he had guests for meetings. When he asked them whether they wanted a tea or coffee and brought in his secretary to take the orders, if he said please, then she would take the coffee or tea out of the coffee machine and put it into a china cup. If he didn't say please, then they'd bring it in the plastic cup. So it was a little touches of making life simple for himself. He obviously had to entertain business people, but Dad was not a drinker, and a lot of the British people he had to entertain, especially, were they like to have a drink. So he'd have a relationship with the barman at the restaurant or the waiter, and if he ordered the gin and tonic and said please, then they'd just give him the tonic without the gin, so that he could actually last the length of the meal without falling asleep. And he had a very steely side to him. I know when later in life he was threatened by having unions at his factory. He found a way to stop that happening, which was to a degree brinkmanship, as those situations often can be. But he had the chutzpah, the nous, the balls, excuse my language, to do those. And that steeliness obviously came from his upbringing and having to look after himself.